we keep throwing out words like connectivity. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what connectivity is before we go any farther. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that bigger picture, why we're having this conversation tonight, making sure we're all on the same page. We'll dive down a little bit deeper into what's happening right here locally, where I know the working group will be talking a little bit about what they've done so far, but also any of you who want to talk about things that have been happening in your regions or your towns can also feel free to add those to the conversation. Then we'll jump to Jens, who will be talking more about some of the larger picture issues, what's happening in other regions, what resources could be available for a working group working on these issues. And then we'll go into what does it even take to start a group? What does success look like for collaboration like this across towns? And then we can open the discussion to you all about ways that you might like to move forward, or comments that you have, or suggestions that you have, or really anything that you want to share at that point. So, to start out with, really what this is about, when you strip it all down, it's about forest. We have a lot of forest in Vermont, and that's good because there are a lot of benefits. It benefits all of us. And I'm going to pause for just a moment here and think about some of the benefits of forests to us, anybody in the state. There's biological diversity, wildlife, habitat. There's scenery. We love our views. Our forests provide clean air and clean water. Our forests are the basis of our forest products industry, which is a pretty big industry in Vermont. Provides the recreation and tourism that brings in not only our own enjoyment, but a lot of tourist dollars as well. These forests help prevent erosion and reduce flooding. They provide land for hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing. There are some studies that have come out recently that indicate that larger forests carry fewer tick-borne illnesses, which is becoming increasingly important. And of course, in these days where we throw around the term climate change or similar terms, they also sequester carbon, and this is part of the equation. Now, I could have put dollar signs next to a bunch of those, so I want to spend another moment just thinking about purely the economic impacts of having these large forests. Really, Vermont's forests really power our economy, and that's through forest recreation and tourism and the forest products industry. Together, those equal about 12% of our state GDP, or 20,000 jobs in the state, which is pretty substantial. If you look at just the tourism industry in the state, about 25% of all of our tourist income comes from the fall foliage season. And that's really directly related to our forests. Hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing provide $685 million into our state's economy. That's just those wildlife-related activities. And there's also a lot of evidence to show that when you keep forests next to wetlands or streams or rivers or waterways, the damage that is not done, the damage that is saved by having those forested areas is a very substantial dollar amount. In other words, if those forests were not there, the destruction would be much larger. But keeping them there really saves Vermont money. And so when we're really looking at our forests, what I want to keep in mind is this whole landscape as a working landscape. This is the place where we do all of those things. It's important for our ecology, it's important for our working forests, it's important for our recreation. And so what we're really looking to do is to think about how the health of these forests impacts all of us. It impacts our economy, it impacts our community enjoyment of the place. And so how can we move our forests forward to protect that whole system, that whole triangle? Now we're fortunate that in Vermont today, we have a lot of forest. About 79% of our state's land area is covered in forest. If you go up in an airplane and you look down on the state, you're going to see a lot of green, right? But here's what's happening. Even though our state is very heavily forested, 79% forest, it's changing over time. And here's what's happening. I have an aerial photo here from 1962. The photo was taken in the northern part of the state, but what we see is the same trend as what you're going to see here, happening throughout the state. Now, to make it easier to see, we have this colored in green. And the green represents the patches of forest in this area. Now, to think about what's going on in these pictures, I'd like you to imagine a black bear. This starts out over here and is trying to move through the forests on the screen. Could probably connect down here into this bigger patch of forest, go up to the north, and our forest is very windy right now. It can connect really to any of the forests across that screen without too much trouble. Now let's see what happens over time. Here's 1962. Here's 1974. 1980. 1996. 2007. And 2011. Now what happened to that forest? And you see how the pattern changed. If you think about that bear moving across the landscape, it's not quite as easy anymore, right? But here's the thing I didn't tell you at the beginning. Right here, the amount of green, if you just look at that green cover, there's the same amount of green cover on this screen as there was in that 1962 picture. The amount of forest cover, the number of trees, if you will, the amount of land area covered by trees, is really no different. Some of those farm fields grew up, and each of these roads and each house doesn't take up a lot of land area. But what's different is the pattern. The pattern of our forests has changed substantially over time. And when we're talking about the word fragmentation, when that comes up, this is what we're talking about. We're breaking those big chunks of forest into smaller and smaller pieces. Now that's important for a number of reasons. I work for Fish and Wildlife, so I'm going to focus on wildlife alone for a minute. But now I know you probably can't read this from the back, and it doesn't matter. What it represents is this. If you take undeveloped forest, and you think about all the species that that undeveloped forest would have, a really big block of forest, and then you break it into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller chunks. The orange lines have crossed out the species that would no longer be in that forest. And you can see that as you break it into smaller and smaller chunks, you lose species. They just won't be there anymore. Until you get to the smallest blocks of forest where you still have some wildlife, but it's mostly going to be the squirrels and the rabbits and the skunks. Still wildlife, still there, but not the diversity that we have in those bigger blocks of forest. Looking back at a landscape like this, you can kind of translate to, you can see where the forest patches are that would be big and biodiverse and have lots of species. And one way to look at whether or not things can get across this landscape is to look at some of these larger mammals that cover big territories. Something like a black bear, where you can imagine that as a black bear comes out of its den in early spring, it's going to be eating one food source. It's going to be looking for the early plants that come up and foraging on those. And then as the berries become ripe, they might be in a different part of the forest. And this time of year, as it's looking for the beech nuts and acorns, they might be in a different place. It's going to need to end up traveling in an extensive location to get all the food sources it needs. Now, these aren't the only species that matter in terms of these connections. A lot of species would use these connections or move over time. They're important for many things. But it's really helpful, I think, to imagine those species moving across this landscape to really see whether it connects.
How big are the squares?
What was that?
There's a grid on there. How many acres is a grid?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I have a different slide that actually labels the acres.
Okay.
These ones are if you connect the whole forest block, then these ones are both in the thousands of acres. But then down here in this middle section, it kind of breaks up. And looks, this is a different landscape, but same idea, more like this. It's these middle areas, not the big blocks, that are really important to focus on when you're thinking about these connections. These are the pathways. Where if you think about these as these bigger forest habitat blocks, well, that's terrific. Those can hold lots of wildlife. But what happens to those populations if nothing can get between them. And so oftentimes it's these landscapes that are just as important when we think about how everything connects across the landscape. You have not only those big forest blocks, but what about this area? I might call it a stepping stone. It might not be the biggest, best habitat around. It's probably not going to have the most species, but for something to get from here across to here, it's pretty essential. Now, how about these ones? These are roads. This is a pretty major road. How do wildlife get across those roads? These are definitely not the best patches of forest habitat around, but again, they're really important for things moving through the landscape. Or this. The trees next to a river or stream are often the pathway an animal would take when it's traveling across the landscape. We sometimes call these habitat connectors, and since numerous people at the beginning talked about Act 171, you'll notice that this is the same vocabulary that's used in Act 171 to identify large forest blocks and habitat connectors. And for anybody who doesn't know what I mean, town planning commissions are needing to identify these in the town planning process. To zoom in to a study that illustrates this, a number of years ago in Vermont, there was a study that put collars on bobcats and tracked where they went across time. So during the bobcat's active hours, each one of these little dots was a beep where it took a GPS point and located that bobcat as it moved through its daily routines. And you can see a number of trends from this. This cat spent most of its time in either this forest habitat or in this wetland, but when it ventured into new territory, look where it went. Most of the time we can tell that these were using even just that narrow hedgerow, a few trees between two farm fields. That's where it's going to get across the road. So even these little connections for some species are enough to make this pathway. To zoom out, we have maps that show connectivity. So fragmentation is the breaking apart. Connectivity is the putting back together, how things link those pathways. And we've mapped the most likely routes for wildlife to travel across the whole state, which you can see here in the dark brown color. And there are some patterns that emerge. Like, for example, there's this pathway that goes all up and down, north and south on the Green Mountains, where there are lots of big blocks of forest. But there are also some side paths, including the one that I'm sure you're recognizing down here in this area. And we can also zoom out even farther. Jens will go more into detail, I believe, later, about a larger initiative, the Staying Connected initiative, that looks not just at the state level, but about how wildlife connect at the larger landscape. So not only in Vermont, but over to New York, down into Massachusetts, up through Maine, into Canada, all the way to the Gaspé Peninsula. And looking at how wildlife right now can travel throughout that region. But if you'll notice the colored areas on this map, those are places that we're really watching. Right now there are pathways, but if those were severed, it could really limit the ability of wildlife to travel throughout that whole area. And you'll notice that Vermont is right at the crossroads. It's a really important place for maintaining this entire network across the Northeast. And here's the thing, all scales matter. So what happens here with this hedgerow between farm fields, the bobcat that crosses that road? That's what is making up some of these connections at the state level. It's what's making up these connections at the multi-state, the international level. So what happens to every one of these little connections here could have impacts at that scale, which I think is really cool to think about. Yeah.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
So is this a meta-analysis of all of these examples? Like a bobcat, and you have another one for rabbits, and you have another one for squirrels and bears, and they're all put together in a scientifically
Do you mean
evidence-based?
this map and this map?
I mean,
So
the
it's
arrows,
not that specific.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, so it's not that specific. It's taken from a number of different sources, but it's really thinking about kind of takes the basis from that study that I showed earlier where there were lots of species in those larger forest blocks and then it got smaller and smaller and dropped out. So studies like that have really been influential in these maps, where it looks for, instead of looking at the individual bobcats and where they're going, it can look at where that habitat is, where it's found on the landscape, and where there are those connections between them. Does that make sense?
Yes and no. I don't really understand how you put this together scientifically. How do people put all this mass of data that is collected in different methods?
Right.
How do you come up with that in a believable way?
Yeah. Well, so it is a really complex process. Jens can jump in too if you'd like. There's actually, so this is actually part of an even bigger study that's really looking at where is the wildlife habitat. Now, of course, we're looking at wildlife habitat in a really general sense. So it's looking at what are the places in Vermont, or what are the habitat types that are most likely to hold the most species. So instead of looking at it specifically like you were talking about with bobcats and rabbits and bears and animals individually, it's looking at the studies that show where all of those animals are, the studies that show which areas have the most biological diversity, and then linking those together. So we have really good maps of just what's covering the land in different places, what habitat types are in all of these different places. Sometimes it can be a general analysis of, is it forest, is it not, is it deciduous forest, is it coniferous forest? But this is mostly looking at where are those blocks of habitat. It's undeveloped land. Those are the places where there's going to be the most diversity. How do those connect across the landscape? Does that make sense? So it's not based on these individual species as much as it's just looking at that overall habitat.
I have a suggestion.
And modeling.
There's a habitat map that Vermont puts out, and it's in layers. And you can see how the layers all fit together to make these tiers that we're going to talk about.
I think, are you talking about the BioFinder website?
BioFinder, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is a website where you can explore this data in more detail, called BioFinder. Yep.
Can I offer some ecological context? So with connectivity research, it's been a big focus, like maybe even becoming the biggest focus in biodiversity conservation the last 30 years. The principal threat to species survival, let alone ecological integrity, is habitat loss. And the quickest way habitat is lost is not by total elimination of habitat, like Monica showed on that slide, where over 50 years we still have the same amount of forest, the same amount of habitat, but now it's broken into chunks, and now it's no longer necessarily viable for the native species. We've realized that no single national park, even the biggest ones in the lower 48 states, has enough habitat area to maintain every single native species. That's talking on a scale well beyond what we have here. I mean, there are some national parks that are a substantial fraction of Vermont, and they're not even big enough to maintain all of their native species, and therefore their native ecosystems. So for any single place on the planet to persist, for life as we know it, these intact ecosystems and communities to persist, they have to be connected. That's not a question. The question is, how do we make those connections? And what this has been doing is figuring out where the most intact connections still are and how they can fit together to maintain the viability of this landscape indefinitely into the future. So you can certainly, in any one of these systems, you can go in and do that detailed research and have a layer for each species of how much fragmentation pushes it out, not only as a general habitat area number, but in terms of what quality of connections are needed there. But that's sort of missing the point. The point is that if we lose connections, we lose biodiversity. And if we lose biodiversity, our ecosystems unravel and fall apart. And in order to maintain that, the number one priority is these connections. Another way to think about it, just to get a little more sciencey, is metapopulations. There are a whole bunch of areas on the planet where if you, even in the very short term, let alone in centuries, where national parks lose their wildlife, but if you fragment that system in a generation, it starts to decline or the population is gone. Say bears are here in abundance, but you lose the connection and persisting numbers because the area is way too small. And it's only not as an independent population, but as a satellite population through demographic interchange with surrounding areas. So if we were to say here, what are, 4 or 5 of the most area sensitive species, and we map their range, and then we imagine cutting some number of these borders, we could be pretty reliable in our ability to say where we would no longer have those sensitive species any longer and where the ecosystems would start to fall apart. So really, this is just about saying we know what the consequences of not doing this are and how is the best way to do it, not whether it's an important thing to do or not.
In the interest of time, I'm going to try to move forward, but I do invite you to talk to me later more about how this data set is put together as well, for anybody else. But I do just want to say, again, this isn't just for those wildlife, even though that wasn't our example. It's really about connecting all of these benefits that we discussed earlier that we have of our forests. Because really fragmenting those and breaking them into smaller pieces makes forestry difficult and makes recreation difficult. Most of these values that provide us benefits from the forest are also going to be compromised as our forest gets smaller and smaller. Now, I'm not going to go into the tools right now of how to keep those there, but I am just going to show this image that I stole from the Nature Conservancy that just really shows, okay, there are many ways of moving forward. Part of this equation is making roads safer. Part of this equation is providing wildlife-friendly management practices, landowners on their own individual properties. Some of it is thinking about those river corridors and maintaining vegetation next to them. Some of it is thinking about development patterns and thinking about where they are most appropriate. And every community might have a different combination of what makes sense for you. But really it's about connecting this landscape so that people and wildlife can continue to thrive there. Now, I know you're probably really curious when I keep showing this map, and you're probably thinking, but I want to see that area right there, that's us, because that's natural when you see a map. So I am going to zoom in a little bit. Sorry for the color switch, but now we have what we call the highest priority connectivity blocks. So those blocks that are most likely to connect. The ones that were brown on that last map are now on darkest green. And then the lighter ones are still priority, though there's still good connections, but maybe not to the same priority at the state level for maintaining those connections. And then I'll zoom in even further so that you can see this area. I think I may have zoomed in past. Did I leave any towns out when I zoomed in? Okay. We can explore that a bit later, and maybe I'll just leave that up as we go into what's happening locally.
So a number of these towns that collectively link the Massachusetts border up to the Green Mountain National Forest have had some form of thought process. How do we protect the future of the life that's native here, the wildlife that makes this place home to us, is why we're here. It's an inspiration on a daily basis for recognizing that every species is part of a living ecosystem. And if we start to lose species, we start to lose that ecosystem, and we start to lose our own home too. And over time, for a lot of us, it's become clear that there's no way we can do this on our own. In Marlboro, where I've been working with the Conservation Commission, we had a major effort over about 10 years, mostly preceding my time, to look at how can we protect wildlife movement in town. And it didn't work, probably partly because it wasn't in this big context. It was just imagining Marlboro in itself, which makes no sense if you're talking about movement connections. But even if it had succeeded perfectly, if everything that had been suggested went forward and everyone was on board, that wouldn't matter without Halifax and Guilford connecting to the south, without Newfane and Wardsboro and Dover, and a little bit of Stratton connecting to the National Forest, collectively making this arterial flow of wildlife through this area, which is what maintains the diversity in every single part here, as in the same forest habitat characteristics not linked this way would be very much impoverished and very much less diverse. So without everyone still having this habitat connection, whatever it takes in each town to steward this, it doesn't matter what any one town does. And recognizing that, we put the question out, who would like to look at this together and say, At the very least, there's a pretty important connection between the national forest and the areas to our south. Certainly there are really important connections out of here too, but this one is the artery, and these are smaller blood vessels. So starting with that arterial flow and inviting and hoping that this will become much more of a circulation network, what can we do and how can we do it together? And as I'm setting up a few more pictures to look at, could we just do a quick show of hands, the people who've been involved thus far in the working group? Those of us who came together in Marlboro in the spring. So not everyone who was part of that's here. A bunch of people are out of state or ill or caring for relatives, but we have begun a process of working together as a group of what I guess 6 towns who've all had representatives come together and say, yeah, we think this matters and we know we can't do it on our own, so let's talk about how we can do it together. Not as in what's the one thing every town's going to be forced to agree to, but what are the values that we can recognize here so that we can bring them back to our own home communities and figure out what makes sense, as Monica was describing, what makes sense where we live to take care of these issues in our own way. Yeah?
How are you selling that to, let's say, a property owner? Now, if the property owner wanted to develop his or her land, you really can't control that.
Mm-hmm.
So are these corridors that you're talking about primarily undevelopable land?
So what I'll say that's mostly jumping the gun. That's maybe a year or 2 years from now to figure out exactly what might be proposed in each town, and it probably would be a different version in each town, and there are a whole bunch of different approaches that can be taken and have been taken, and we'll hear about a lot more of those later today, different examples of things that can work. And it ranges anything from education and leaving it up to people's goodwill to organized but informal effort to some form of direct conservation initiative, whether that's easements or whether that's zoning, to even regional partnerships that take a much broader view and have more resources to put into the process. So those are really important questions, but right now we're basically just setting a stage saying there are some concerns here, they seem like they have some significance. Collectively, do they matter to us? And if so, how do we want to begin a process of looking at them together, if that makes sense? And just to touch again on this map, this area is huge. This is a whole huge chunk of North America. This is not just central and northern New England, 2/3 of New England. It's also the entirety of the Maritimes provinces in Canada. It's a large section of eastern Quebec, and it's a substantial amount of upstate New York as well. That's a tremendous area. Vermont is a relatively small component of it, and we're a relatively tiny component of Vermont. Nonetheless, at this level, there are 9 areas that are considered to be the critical gateways between areas of the wild, where right now they maintain the diversity and integrity of the wild systems in this huge chunk of the continent, and if any one of them is lost, there's serious jeopardy to the entire rest of the ecoregion. These are the areas that aren't the wild themselves, but they're the most vulnerable and critical connections, one of which is down here in central New England. We're actually at the very northern periphery of it. It mostly extends down through the Berkshires and into the edge of Connecticut and New York State. And we zoom in a little further into this southernmost of these 9 critical connections. Here we are in southern Vermont. It's artificially defined by the Route 9 corridor. Really what that means is you need to be able to get beyond Route 9. So up here north of Route 9 matters too. And the reason it matters is that huge band that Monica already showed a map of up and down the spine north-south of the Green Mountains is the be-all and end-all of wildlife linkages. North-south here, this is a north-south linkage. You have to get from it into the Green Mountains for things to work out. So this whole area immediately north of Route 9 matters just as much as the area immediately south that's actually shown in here, because without that, the whole thing falls apart. If everything north of Route 9 was severed in a small band, this area would have no significance any longer. So we matter just as much as things down there. And when we zip in a little further, we can see these high priority connections shown between the Green Mountain National Forest and the Mass border, recognizing that there are very important connections at the state level, but not necessarily at the ecoregion level that are part of this. And it would be really wonderful if this grew out to become a collaborative effort between a wider array of towns, maybe even throughout the county. And certainly any part of this corridor would be more robust with more connections associated with it. But no matter what, that arterial flow is here, and that's where we felt like we needed to start in approaching this. And I'll take us through briefly 2 other sets of slides. All right, so here we are again. This is our corridor. What are the areas that are of the most significance? In the same way as at the ecoregion scale, it's the areas that are the pinch points that are most jeopardized, already threatened by development, already partially fragmented, that are the most concern. We can see that there's Route 100 over here, right by the National Forest. There's significant impingement there. There's Route 9 through east-west through the center of our linkage. And there's substantive but not quite as extreme compromise, impacts there, mostly from the big highway, less development. It's not right by Mount Snow or Stratton Mountain. And then there's sort of this area between Wardsboro, Dover, and Newfane that includes Dover Road, where there's some more significant impingement. And just looking in a little further, we can sort of hone in on these 2 northern areas and see that there is this very narrow connection without which this whole arterial flow is severed and bust on Route 100. The good news is that on this side is all undevelopable forest. It's all town forest and then national forest. On this side, you get into the national forest again pretty quickly. In between, there is private land, but it's really near 2,500 feet above which development is not allowed in Vermont. So there's only a really narrow band on one side of Route 100 that needs attention. But without that, this whole thing would be jeopardized. Over here near Newfane, Wardsboro, and Dover, we can see this patchwork of fragmentation. There's a mostly forest here, but already there's been perforation and then connections between the perforation that risk jeopardizing the movement of wildlife through that area. That's another important threat. Down here in the center, Route 9 in Marlboro, you can zoom in and see that there's again a little bit of a pinch point. And I'll get to a few slides really quick that demonstrate a different aspect of this besides what's shown on the map. But we can see that where Route 9 comes through, things narrow down, there's less connection, and there's a little bit of interruption there too. Between the traffic and that interruption, there are concerns for the viability of biodiversity in our area there too. And finally, as a case study, what's happened in Marlboro. Here's that same map with the critical, arterial linkage north and south through Marlboro. Here's an outline of the interior forest patches. There's been a zoning process in Marlboro where they're not outright protected, not even close, but there's now a review process. If any development's proposed more than 500 feet from a road, it goes through review to make sure that it's done in the gentlest way it could be done to avoid having major fragmenting effects on wildlife. That takes care of these interior areas, but again, it's not the amount of habitat that's left, it's the connections between it that we're most concerned about. We had, again, that 10-year-old process of proposing a bunch of connection points across roads. This network, which wasn't designed in terms of this arterial flow, this north-south connection up to Newfane and east-west to the National Forest, but you can see how it provides a whole bunch of links north and south through this area. However, that became contentious, partly through some limited communication process that let people feel like something was happening behind their backs they were surprised by. And whatever the cause, the Planning Commission decided to remove this from the proposed zoning. No one got to vote on it. The upside of that is there's an opportunity to improve on the design, but nonetheless, what was done in some sense is a good move, but it doesn't matter if these connections get severed. In terms of ecology, we will not have substantial arterial flow of wildlife if we lose our connections across these roads. And Marlboro still hasn't figured out what to do about that. That's something we hope might emerge from this process. And it would probably emerge a lot better as a collaboration than Marlboro doing it on its own. Here's some stuff last winter. I'm an ecologist and a tracker, and I've been going out and collecting data on where wildlife move in town. These are the 5 most area-sensitive species. There's otter, that was already mentioned, that requires huge amounts of river and shoreline habitat. Those are these round circles. There's fisher, which are the most active area-sensitive species in Marlboro. There are all these X's that are kind of almost everywhere. There's bear, these rectangles or squares. There is moose, which are these diamonds, a few of them. And there's also one bobcat, this plus sign, which I highlighted here. We do have more data than this from several years, but most of our data is from last winter, and it's collected in a new system that we haven't integrated yet, so I'm only showing recent data. Comparing this network of documented wildlife movement to this conservation design that was developed in Marlboro, we can see that there are a bunch of places where there's a concentration of wildlife movement right where we have them marked on the map. There are some places like here and here and here that we have, and here that we have substantial data recently, but not as recently as the stuff that's in the system that's mapped here. However, you can see that there are some places that don't make sense at all, that we don't see substantial wildlife crossing. If you look at it on the map, there just isn't good habitat there anyway. And there's some areas, this most especially, but a number of these spots where there's significant wildlife movement of area-sensitive species that we're really concerned about that haven't been addressed. And in terms of what we're talking about here, it's really striking to notice that there's a substantial amount that's outside of what's defined as that arterial flow. There's actually a really critical crossing north and south here that's really quite peripheral to how that artery is mapped. But what we're finding out by doing this on the ground is that there are some very important areas that, based on the statewide approach to mapping what's critical and the computer sort of algorithms and broad brush approaches to what matters to wildlife movement and what doesn't, as we would expect, that misses some important things locally. One of the most important, I'll skip back a few, is this spot. It's just a tiny little patch of habitat. It's not included in the dark brown. It's not considered part of the artery. But if we were to lose that, we would lose about half of our wildlife road crossings north and south that we've documented along Route 9. This is critical. So there's also a need, if this is done anywhere, and if this is something that emerges as a collaboration between towns, to figure out not just what does it say on the map from a computer at a very huge scale, but how can we refine that at our local scale, and what approaches do we need to take to make sure we encompass stuff, even to either side of the critical areas, especially along big barriers like Route 9, that appear to really matter. Honing in a little further, we can see that there's basically 1, 2, 3, 4 crossing areas on one side of Route 9 that aren't comprised within the existing state-level design, and there's one on the west side of Route 9 that's also not in there. I'll add that what I found is I have to actually walk Route 9 to get good data. The snowbanks are simply too huge and there's too much sun and it melts too much to actually get good detections while driving. So the fact that we don't have detections here is probably more an artifact that I haven't actually walked alongside the road there than that isn't significant for wildlife. And that's another thing we have to take into account, the degree to which this approach is utilized in the future. Yeah.
How did you get the data of what the wildlife crossed where?
By driving the road and noticing where there were trails crossing the road, getting out and identifying the trails, and using a program called iNaturalist that involves taking a photograph and taking extensive field data to document it, which then is available to the universe to review and confirm the identification, although I'm an experienced enough tracker that I can basically do that on my own. But it also means that anyone in town or anyone anywhere can do this and contribute to a project. This project could be set up at the level of this arterial flow or this whole county. And people could contribute identifications and have people like myself who have the expertise review them, confirm the identification, and have really good quality data.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add, in case it's easier to see, here's a different mapping system with those same crossings. They're a little less messy here. The dots are a little neater. And again, honing in on Route 9, we can see those clusters of dots outside of that critical band of north-south habitat. So that's just sort of getting into some of what's happened so far or been approached or documented here. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that more. But briefly, is there anyone from other towns here who's worked with some of these questions about maintaining connections and maintaining wildlife movement or habitat integrity, who would want to contribute any other insights from stuff that's happening here now or recently? I know Andy, who chairs the Conservation Commission in Dover, wasn't able to be here tonight, but this is something that they've worked with in Dover to some degree, and he's got some strong experience that he feels like he can contribute to us. I'll just add that there'll be a follow-up meeting to this. We're sort of breaking this into 2 sessions. The first one is more like, here's the context, here's the questions, how do we want to move forward with this, and if so, generally how? And then the next meeting will be 3rd Tuesday in October. We're anticipating it'll be the same place and time, but we'll send out an announcement either way. And that will be getting into more of the nitty-gritty if we do want to move forward to begin that process collaboratively in some more detail. But I think
I'm sensitive to what we're talking about here, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate. If those connections were to go away, would we lose the habitat, or would they find an alternative route to get through those corridors?
that's a really good point. If there are still connections elsewhere that are less desirable, it's possible that movement will shift, but it's not linear. It's not just, is there a viable connection across a given road somewhere? When people actually have done the research scientifically about what it takes to maintain these connections, what's realized is it's basically about the sum total of landscape resistance. If you had a metric, say, from 0 to 10, 10 would be like a super highway with industrial strips on either side, and 0 would be just continuous forest, and measured the amount of landscape resistance at any given point, and then you totaled that up between point A and point B in between. That would be how good the connection is. It wouldn't be, this connection kind of works and that one kind of works, and there's 6 of these that kind of work in a row, so we think it's okay. The sum total resistance there would probably be beyond the toleration of a lot of these species, and that probably would form a barrier, even though it looks like there's somewhat viable forest-ish connections everywhere. So
I should tell you, I have an observation over years of hunting near my place in Pennsylvania, is that over generations, doesn't matter what barriers you're putting away, those critters want to follow the same trails that they followed, that their great grandparents followed. It seems like it's really hard to get those critters to deviate from that existing preferred path.
I would also add that we're not just talking about getting Bambi across the road again and again. Why we started at the landscape scale is because this is about genetic connectivity, right? So you have a population in the Adirondacks of moose, you have a population in the Green Mountains of moose. If the Green Mountain population becomes totally isolated, it will become more and more inbred and will die out. So it's necessary from that wildlife perspective, for new genes to come in. So that moose swimming across Lake Champlain isn't necessarily just that random moose. It's that moose carrying a new set of genes that will make our population healthier and more able to withstand disturbance. It's also on the scale of climate change. So it's not just individual animals moving back and forth, it's entire species adjusting their ranges in the face of a warming climate. And so we're not just talking about animals that are here now even, we're talking about an influx of central New England, southern New England species moving north. Already entire species are adjusting their range on average a mile a year away from the equator, north and south, to adjust away from that warming band. And so we're looking at this larger system because we're wanting to allow for those once-a-generation movements to maintain our species. But then even more than that, it's just about keeping forests connected. And we already have that. We're just trying not to screw up what we got. We're the envy of New England in terms of maintaining that connected network. We're just trying not to screw it up.
But for those of us that would be trying to promote this initiative, those things that are crucial for us,
Yeah.
let's fall back.
Yes.
Totally. And I'll just add that it's harder to measure than genetics, but what's become recognized in biodiversity conservation is that even quicker than genetics, populations fall apart and vanish because of demographics. If you don't have exchange of individuals independent of the genetic diversity that maintains, these satellite patches I mentioned when I referred to the term metapopulation, you lose them immediately, right? Theirs are too small to maintain the
If they can't
species in
find a
even a
mate,
few
you lose it,
generations. That means that the other areas around them become isolated, and they have too few individuals, and so over the scale of, say, 10 to 100 generations, random shifts in demography or a sudden storm or major disturbance or disease can bring them to the brink, and then a random generation, it's all males that are born, and then they're just gone. And that often happens quicker than the genetic process. So it's something that doesn't make sense to our sort of linear or almost engineering cultural mindset. But when we start to understand the way systems work and these processes maintain life, those connections are the very quickest and most dangerous thing to be lost.
Thank you. So it sounds like we've heard the example of how one town in this region has moved forward. Are there other towns that would like to share? Or would you like to hear now from Jens, who can tell about how other regions have moved forward and some of the options available? Yeah.
We've talked about in the planning commission.
Right.
And we're going to pull in the conservation commission, haven't done it yet. And we're doing 3 different community forums on different topics. Mm-hmm. And our idea was, there's a lot of people who really don't want to be involved in the planning commission, right, or the towns or anything else. But you know what? They might hunt, they might fish, and they might look out the back door and go, there's that damn bear again. Mm-hmm. And so our idea is to have one of those have maps 5 times, 10 times bigger than this, and match markers, and say, Joe, here's orange, show us where the bear are. Show us, so that we have actual, it's anecdotal, it's not scientific, but it's anecdotal data to track who's in our neighborhood. Does that make sense to the experts?
There are a number of communities that have moved forward with that.
I would just add that this iNaturalist system works on any smartphone, and it's totally free, and it takes a GPS point as well as a photograph, and then you can enter data that a project is trying to collect too, like did this animal cross the road or not, for instance. And with that, it's not just anecdotal, but it becomes entirely verifiable. And that's a pretty easy step to take given the proliferation of smartphones. And if that's of interest to you, I can help you guys set a project up or look at the system.
Is it a one-shot deal? Like 5 years ago, I saw a bear crossing my property. I haven't seen him or her since. So even one sighting is something that you would be interested in.
That's relevant, especially given that a date or a year can be associated with it. It's more helpful if we can actually have a photo that would positively identify, yes, that's a bear track, and then someone could say, yes, and I saw those tracks cross this road. But even at that level, that is useful.
I woke up looking at them.
I think, okay, go ahead.
One of Guilford is the Conservation Commission at the town meeting has been putting up maps off and on for the last 10 years to get people to tell us where they see wildlife. So we have kind of a continuous thing, and just recently Patty gave us indicator species that they wanted to see, so that was this last year.
Terrific. Yeah, well,
Well, I was
one
going to
more.
say, we had talked in Marlboro also about the same thing, putting a map up. Part of that is, crowdsourcing citizen science, but the other part is getting the townspeople engaged in wanting, seeing this as a valuable resource rather than like, oh, here's something else that's going to block what I can do on my land. That if you make it like interactive, like, isn't it exciting to have there and you're thinking about otter? So we've also talked about that. I think iNaturalist is a way of collecting data that, quantifiable, but there's also other value in.
And there's also like social media sites where people chat about things that they've seen that are neat happening in town, and we've thought about ways of collecting some of that information just passively ourselves, or asking people to provide some documentation of it if they're interested as a way to help engage with that process as well.
Well, this conversation sounds like a great segue into what Jens was going to talk about, which is a whole range of options moving forward and what other communities have done. They told us that if we didn't move enough, then the lights would go off. So make a little move around.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Monica. So I'm going to hit what we can do at a few different scales. There are all sorts of things we can do, and at different scales we can do them alone, we can do them together, there are different types of together that we can do these things as well. I think the single most important thing I'm going to say, no matter what activity or action you dream of taking in your town or this group or as a landowner, is celebrating place. And that everything you do, whether you're working with your town PC and CC or whether you're working with a larger group across all southeastern Vermont, is to celebrate place and to have fun and to have potluck dinners together and to just celebrate your love of place. At the level of values, there's incredible consensus across the town on why people live there. There's all sorts of conflict on how do we get from here to there. Oh, you say you don't want development. I do want development because that's how we're going to get there. Whatever, there's conflict at that level, but the underlying value, that love of place, really cuts across all the different groups in town. And so if you connect people to their place, even people with radically different worldviews can connect in the same place. And it's sort of a self-selecting group. The people who live in your town live in there for very, very common reasons. So make sure that it's fun and that you're infusing place with all of it. Orange County Headwaters Project was a group of citizens like yourselves that thought, our forests are more important than they get credit for. And they just organized field walks across different people's land and said, hey, let's celebrate this wetland. Let's celebrate my backyard, my woodlot. And that really rocketed a conservation effort. Conservation easements, just one tool, but in that case, it happened to flow out of that connection to place as it became more and more popular. So land protection is a tool that's available to any willing landowner. And by this, really, there are a few different options, but the main one would be a conservation easement. And so individual landowners can work with Vermont Land Trust or one of the local land trusts to protect their land. And they can set the rules on what is allowed. Is it a farm easement? Is it a forest easement? How much development? We'll take out this 2-acre lot because I might want to develop it in the future, but everything else, you're selling your development rights. You're not selling all of your rights. You're giving away or selling that single right to develop it into the future. And that has significant tax implications in terms of lowering your taxes because you're no longer allowed to develop it. That's not one of the rights that you still hold on to. I'm going to introduce again the Staying Connected Partnership here in a second, but I'll tell you across the entire Northern Appalachians, that big scale map that we've shown, the partnership and all the various partner organizations within it have conserved more than 500,000 acres, and those are connecting lands. That's not the deep dark woods, the core forest. Those are the connections between those forests. So that's a huge number, because connecting lands are often much more expensive than the deep, dark woods. Staying Connected Partners have brought up model easement provisions, have worked with NRCS on cost sharing. So there's a lot we can talk about here on this land protection front, and we can certainly connect your conservation commissions or you as an individual landowner with Vermont Land Trust or some of the other land trusts that are Staying Connected Partners or just local partners. So Staying Connected is this binational collaborative. And the idea here is to focus on habitat connectivity for nature and people across that entire 80 million acre Northern Appalachian ecoregion. So there are lots of different partners involved at a variety of different scales. But I'm going to be talking about really big things right now. But remember, these folks, what the Staying Connected Partnership is trying to do is bring that understanding of the importance of connectivity to this whole region. What you do with that You in the towns have control over your land use planning, and you have regulatory authority. It is not for some binational partnership to tell you what to do. We're telling you that your place is important. You all decide what you do with that and what connectivity looks like and how you're going to balance those private property rights with the rights of the commons. That decision is at a town-specific level. I'm introducing an eco-regional vision that might propel action at that town level. Are you folks with me on that? Okay. So you've seen a lot of this map. I just wanted to clarify, these places, again, are the connecting lands. This is the core forest, the Adirondacks, that's the core. This is the Black River Valley. That's a very threatened valley with a lot of development in it between the Tug Hill Plateau, another piece of core forest, and the Adirondacks. So these colored blobs are those connecting lands, those places that are already experiencing some development where we're worried about it. So this whole area is 80 million acres, but you just see how many of these eco-regionally significant linkage areas are in Vermont. So needless to say, the Staying Connected Partnership is alive and well in Vermont with many major players. Staying Connected includes all of the state fish and wildlife agencies in all of these states, the departments of transportation, and 44 NGO partners. So there's an incredible network of partners. The benefit of that network of partners is that you can have a multi-pronged approach, right? We have some partners that are really good at conservation science. We make the maps. We provide that science background. We have other partners, those land trusts, Vermont Land Trust, Nature Conservancy, are both Staying Connected partners, can work with individual landowners on that land protection front. Monica and I do technical assistance for land use planning and really connect with that land use planning side of things. And then, of course, our departments of transportation work with our fish and wildlife agencies on this road barrier mitigation. And all of us are doing this outreach and education. So the different linkage areas, those different colored blobs, have different recipes. They do things a little different in New Hampshire, needless to say, than they do in Vermont. And so that linkage team, that group of partners and all the local organizations that they interact with, develop an idea of what conservation looks like in that place. And so no two linkages have the same recipe, the same mix of tools. Everyone decides what connectivity is going to look like a little bit differently. So we have some partners that are plugging in at this eco-regional level, some of the organizations that work nationwide or across the whole all the Canadian provinces. We have some state-specific partners, and then we have activities and groups that work only within a specific linkage. So a group such as yourself, if you were interested in becoming more cohesive, could plug in here and get the benefit of all of these other partners. You could be part of a linkage team and get the benefit of the experience of these other partners and these other linkages. You are already a part of a linkage. It is the Green Mountain to Hudson Highlands linkage in Staying Connected language. Ashley explained this map once before, but it's the idea here of cutting it at Route 9 is really the presence of Green Mountain National Forest. From the modeler's perspective in Massachusetts, this, the central part, the southern greens are well conserved, and so getting wildlife to the central greens to the southern greens was the real priority in this linkage, because Massachusetts is so much more fragmented than Vermont. So I put a couple land cover maps out just to give you a sense of where there's forest and where there's open land. And just to give you a sense of what connectivity looks like. I'd say that it's not rocket science. We're just looking for where forest is close together, and that's where wildlife cross. So just looking at those maps, you get you can have a pretty good guess of where wildlife are going to cross. And it's much easier in a more fragmented landscape, i.e. closer to Brattleboro, closer to Bennington, than it is along the spine of the Greens. It's a lot easier to tell where wildlife are going to cross because the connections are much smaller. So from this staying connected perspective, you know, we welcome you to plug in as part of a linkage team, as individuals, as a group, as an individual conservation commission or planning commission. Please check out this website. There's a tremendous array of resources. It's pretty sciencey resources, so be prepared. But there are examples from across the more of a formal group is you know, participating in this RCP and getting sort of recognition at that landscape scale. But again, work is already underway in this Green Mountains to Hudson Highlands linkage. So I would really encourage you to plug in there. Laura Marks from the Nature Conservancy in Western Mass is really leading the charge on that linkage. But you know, all of us in Vermont, the Vermont Staying Connected players are certainly involved as well. But as I said earlier, the action is at the municipal level because towns have land use planning and regulatory authority. So it's the towns that decide where development will happen, where development won't happen. It's the individual town that decides how important are private property rights, how important are the rights of the commons, everybody's rights. What does that balancing act look like? That happens at the town level, and each of your towns has a different view of what that balance should be. So plugging into the municipal system is a great way of affecting where development will happen and where it won't happen. There are not that many people that plug into the municipal system, as you all that serve on CCs and PCs well know. But there is a whole range of options, and some towns, you know, head more towards this non-regulatory side of things, saying, let's just educate our landowners and not do anything regulatory. And that's fine. There are also more regulatory ends of the spectrum, and I'll explain some of these options now at this municipal level. So, of course, land use planning would be a great starting point, and getting involved in your town plan. I'm going to speak about Act 171 in just a second. But just generally, you know, I really encourage conservation commissions to plug in with the town planning process and to be an active player in writing that natural resource section, as well as the transportation, land use sections, and other parts of the plan. But really plugging into that planning system, I think, is incredibly important. Because again, it's the town plans that have that balancing act of what the town sees as its priorities for moving forward. So getting conservation interest, wildlife interest, forest interest, recreation interest, working lands interest into that town plan is critically important. And those town plans then are the basis for, if the town were to choose a regulatory approach, that town plan would be the basis for that regulatory approach. Just a few statistics that you need to know. 96% of Vermont towns have town plans. All of your towns have town plans. The 4% are overwhelmingly in the kingdom. 81% of the towns in Vermont have zoning. That may surprise some of you, because in that 19%, zoning is often a four-letter word, not well received. But it is incredibly common. That doesn't necessarily mean anything good. Some of our zoning codes are really locking us into sprawl development. So the devil's in the details in terms of what's in our zoning. So we need to be really clear. But there's a tremendous rift between the aspirational language of the town plan and what we actually put in zoning. Let me say this more bluntly. There's a lot of talk in town plans, and there's very, very little action. So in some ways you can talk all you want in the town plan, but it doesn't actually affect anything until you've used other tools to come into play. 51% of towns have subdivision regulations, and I would flag that as a really important tool for being able to say where you want development and where you don't, and if you do have development, what type of development it's going to look like.
There's an argument that the subdivision regulations are more important than zoning for wildlife habitat.
I would really agree with that. Given the number of really bad zoning codes that I've seen, I would agree that subdivision gets you much more bang for your buck. But again, it's all about that balancing act and what a town feels is appropriate. So Act 171, sorry for all the text, I borrowed this slide. So Act 171 is a new state law. It requires town plans to identify forest blocks, and wildlife connectors. At the end of the day, it's identify where those blocks are. You want to plan for land development in those areas to minimize forest fragmentation. So a lot of the work that Monica and I are doing are with individual towns, helping them to figure out which forest blocks are most important. Now, we've seen these statewide maps of importance, right? But they're going to be local priorities that don't show up at that statewide scale. So in some towns, we add in forest blocks. We add in those habitat connectors, the small stepping stone blocks that Monica talked about. We add those in as priorities. In other towns, there's some towns in the kingdom that are 96% highest priority. And in those towns, they say, you know what, that's too much. We want more developable land. We're going to take away some of those blocks and really concentrate on those other ones. So the statewide data is a starting point. It's not the end-all, be-all. These maps carry no regulatory weight. The regulatory weight comes in with what your town may or may not decide to do with them. This is a starting point for what's most important for ecological function. And I've also hoped that we've stressed that there's a tremendous amount of flexibility here. Because we can develop a little bit around the outside of the edges of these forest blocks and not necessarily affect that interior forest function. Of course, if you develop right in the middle of one of those pinch points, your development might have exponentially more effect than your neighbor. So it can very much depend on where you are around the edge of the block. Not all of those edges are created equal. So anyway, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility with Act 171, and that's why Monica and I work town by town, helping you all to come up with that set of priorities for your town and putting those maps into your town plan. We've trained all of the regional planning commissions. We work with RPC staff. So if you're connected in with your RPC, you can get them, RPC, Regional Planning Commission, you could get them to call us, or you could call us directly, and we can read the town plan or look at the set of blocks, whatever kind of help you might need. This is just one example of forest pattern in Newfane. You can see the sort of regional context here, and then these individual forest blocks. And then BioFinder would have that overlay of which of these, from the statewide perspective, are the highest priority. And so, some of these smaller blocks may show up as more important or less important than you might expect. So it's very much a starting point for a conversation. So incorporating specific standards, you really, at the town plan level, you really want to identify resources. And then you want to include those specific forest and wildlife standards in your zoning and subdivision. So it's a two-step process. Get the language in the town plan and then set standards. The Vermont Supreme Court had a decision in, I don't know what, probably 6 years ago now, called JAM Golf. The JAM Golf decision, in which they struck down a section of the South Burlington zoning code for being overly vague. They had this laundry list saying, yeah, we want to protect this, we want to protect that, we want to protect that. They didn't say what protect mean. They didn't say where exactly those features were. And so it was too vague, and the Supreme Court threw it out. Why I'm telling you this is your town can get whacked with legal fees if you're not specific. What is in, what is out, and what standard are you holding it to? You have to be specific, and maps are a good way to be specific about what area you're talking about. Now, there's going to be some uncertainty in those maps, but you can still bring in, make a standard that's appropriate for the uncertainty in the science. But we can get into that later. So effective definitions are critically important. 99% of town plans mention wildlife habitat. 2% define it. JAM Golf, you're susceptible. You say, oh, we want to protect wildlife habitat. What is that? You could get ecologists to argue about that all day long and rack up some significant court bills in the process. You need to define it for yourself in your town plan, and then reference that back in your zoning. Having effective zoning districts, examples are conservation districts or forest districts. But you know what? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm out of order here. So having those specialized districts is great. The conservation districts and forest districts, and many of your towns do have those, but it's not enough. Just saying, oh, that part of town, yep, we'll call it a conservation district. The vast majority of your development is happening in your ag and rural residential districts. It's not happening in your growth centers. It's your ag and rural residential districts where growth is happening. So if you want to affect that pattern, you need to look at those districts. Having these districts are great, but it's not the end-all be-all. So another tool we often use are wildlife overlay districts. I'll just show you what that might mean. You see, typical zoning would say different parts of town for different uses. But a lot of natural features like rivers, streams, wildlife connectivity cut across those districts. Sorry, this is a little difficult to see in the back. So what you can do is you can create a new zone based on that natural feature, like a wildlife connectivity area, and say all of the standards of the underlying zone apply here, as well as these additional standards. So an overlay district you can put on top of your existing districts to add a heightened level of review, for example, for development proposals that fall within an overlay.
Can we get these specific maps for our towns from you, or?
Yeah, we'd make them with you. Yes. Yes, so get my card, get Monica's card, call us. We'll show up at your town, and it'll be a process together. If I just dump the maps on your door, it's going to be difficult to interpret, and you're still going to need help figuring out what to do with them. So just give us a call, and we'll do it. Again, here's the vast majority of subdivision occurs within your rural residential districts. 74 to 84% of all subdivision. I'm close. There's all manner of non-regulatory strategies that you can also employ, really helping landowners to understand the current use program, the use value appraisal program. About half of all eligible forest land in Vermont is already enrolled in current use. It significantly lowers the tax burden. It's not permanent conservation by any means, but it does help keep the farms intact, help keep the forest intact. There's, estate and conservation planning. My in-laws are in their 70s on 160 acres in Stratford. They've got 4 kids, one in New York, one in Connecticut, one in Vermont. Knowing about conservation doesn't make the discussions about what's going to happen to their land any easier, but those conversations are incredibly important. And if my in-laws decide to divide that 4 different ways, then we're the face of parcelization, which often leads to fragmentation. So those are really important discussions. They're very personal discussions, but it's an important conversation. And then lastly, there are a couple resources that I just want you to be aware of. This is a book that's only online. We're about to print it any day now, fingers crossed, called Mapping Vermont's Natural Heritage, that explains the Vermont conservation design, that dark green, light green map that we keep showing you of the highest priority areas. It explains how to use that in land use planning. And then community strategies for Vermont's forest and wildlife from Vermont Natural Resources Council really gets into each of those land use planning and regulatory tools. How do I do an effective conservation district? What are some case studies of good overlay districts? What does it look like to write a bomb-proof subdivision code? So getting into those individual strategies there. But again, we partner with VNRC all the time. We're happy to provide that sort of service. And also, when the questions get too land use planner-y, we can bring in partners to really advise us on that side of things. So that was a whirlwind tour into this whole huge range of options, but I just wanted to be sure that you all knew that you can move forward on this as a landowner on your own. You can plug into your town, and get your Conservation Commission, Planning Commission to move forward on these and look at options at the municipal level. And you can form a group together, be it a regional conservation partnership, a working group, part of that Greens to Hudson Highlands linkage, and advance, come up with strategies to advance this work across the whole region. So there are a bunch of different ways to plug in, and we're happy to help you with any of them. Just give us a call. Thanks.
you have a question for Jens?
Yeah, I have a question about
Sorry.
bridges and/or underpasses
Yes.
for wildlife.
Yes.
Do we have any in Vermont? Or so where are they?
We have many underpasses. And that's really, I am the point person between the department and the Agency of Transportation. And so we really focus on those underpasses to help move wildlife and also move floodwater and also move aquatic organisms. So you can buy 3 underpasses for every overpass. That's very much the work of the department and the Agency of Transportation. While towns have some control over the municipal infrastructure, generally that stuff is planned years in advance. So I didn't include that as an option here because it's not a great starter project for towns. You have to be 10, 15 years out to even be in the conversation. So there's a lot there. There's a whole lot there. But I'm just going to sidestep a bit of it for now. I will mention that there are several bridges on Route 9 that we've been monitoring for several years. They're passing whole families of bear, as well as our most southern documented lynx passed through one of those bridges last year. So there is infrastructure that is moving wildlife.
So you talked earlier about the Department of Transportation and that partnership,
Yes.
and I'm kind of thinking it goes along with these underpasses.
Yes.
How do you identify areas where there's a lot of wildlife being hit by cars, and then are these underpasses created there, or what's done when you identify that?
So starting with roadkill isn't necessarily the best way to go. Starting with where there's forest on both sides of the road is the best way to go. Because that hit animal could be crossing in the best place, or it could be crossing in the worst place, and that's why it was hit. So really looking at where there are forest blocks is a great starting place, and then where there are streams. Because you get more species crossing in those stream valleys than you do on a terrestrial,
Prepare for success in this region. Now, there's a working group. It's a working group in its very early stages, as I understand it. And I also understand that this meeting was partly this idea of getting everybody together to discuss as a group for kind of one of the first times how to move forward. And this early stage is a really great opportunity to think about what does success look like for groups doing this kind of project across Vermont. Now, the Agency of Natural Resources actually has a much longer course, a 4-hour course, about taking action in your community. And we offered it here. Actually, I think a couple of you were involved in that a couple years ago when we had it here. We have one coming up at Municipal Day in Montpelier in October. Let me know if you're interested in learning more. But I wanted to give just a couple quick notes about this course, which is the Agency of Natural Resources. Everybody who works with municipal efforts got together and said, this is what we've seen in communities that have started with a project and been able to move forward successfully. And this is the class where we've accumulated all those together. We've compiled them and given some case studies and said, these are the steps to success. So the first thing is really in that identifying the group itself, like maybe this working group could be, to move that effort forward. Thinking about who should be involved. Now, what we've found is that it's most successful when there's an existing group. Maybe it's people who are on the existing planning or conservation commissions, but where you're really thinking about the views represented on that working group. So building a team that's lots of different viewpoints that overlap in some common vision. Maybe that vision is looking at a connected landscape, but making sure, even in this room, I heard some concerns about landowner concerns and private property. Making sure that viewpoint is represented on the team. Thinking about some of the other concerns that you might have, the other viewpoints in your community, and making sure that that team that you build represents the range of who's here. So that you can be looking at a common vision from the beginning, instead of one team with one common viewpoint coming to a conclusion and then trying to push it to the next town, or push it into another team and trying to convince everybody, you're going to have some common ground from the beginning. Does that make sense? So thinking about those viewpoints. The other thing that's really important in thinking about a team and building this team is to consider the team roles. What strengths does each person on that team bring? And perhaps even more importantly, what gaps does that team have? Now, there are numerous rubrics for looking at these team roles. I'm going to highlight one that's called Belbin. It's Belbin's team roles. And this strategy says there are really, you can ignore all of this for now, just look at these first columns. There are really 3 types of people, and all of these types of people are needed on a team. You need somebody who's action-oriented, who can really get things done. You need somebody who's people-oriented. That's the person who can really collaborate and coordinate your efforts. It's the person who sees the people and how they all connect. And you need somebody who's thought-oriented, who comes up with the ideas and maybe has that knowledge base. And so as you start a team, it's important to think about the importance of every single one of those roles. I bet everybody here has been on some team where you think, well, that person has the ideas and they're kind of leading the way, so I'm not going to step on their toes. And it's really important when you work on a team to make sure to have all of these roles represented. Sometimes you can combine them into one person. Sometimes it's distributed out. But my husband is a good example. He's very thought-oriented. He comes up with all these great ideas. But if he's trying to lead, it doesn't really work. He will try to lead an effort, and he's just not the leader type. It really takes somebody else to coordinate those into a team effort. So think about the best roles for everybody. Another thing, identify the vision. What does success look like? Early on, as you coordinate this group, think about that end vision. Jens mentioned this too. We can probably discuss all day about what the steps, what the strategies look like. Some people are all about zoning. Some people want nothing to do with zoning. That causes arguments, but I bet you can agree on a vision. What do you want that end product to look like? Bringing in these different viewpoints and trying to agree on that vision is much easier than starting with a step-by-step process. Thinking about a roadmap, and the thing I'm going to highlight here is the timeline. If you start a working group, what kind of commitment are you looking for? Are you starting something as a 1-year process? Are you starting something for a 20-year commitment? Make sure that the members of the working group have some kind of idea of what timeline you're working towards, so to avoid burning out and just kind of plodding forward and not knowing. I'll just give a resource here. There's the Community Heart and Soul Field Guide is available online. You can also ask me for more details afterwards. And then also really think about what makes people want to engage. And make sure you provide these opportunities to the working group. People want to make a difference. People want to know that their efforts won't be wasted. They want to be part of a successful enterprise and see concrete results, forge relationships, to learn and be challenged. Make sure as you're starting this working group and as you reach out to communities to engage other people that these opportunities are there. And perhaps most importantly also, once you have that working group together, starting with identifying what it is that your communities value. If you can start by seeing the value of what your communities value and seeing the overlap with the efforts that you're doing, it'll tell you how to move forward. But without this, it's going to once again be trying to force something on a community that's not necessarily ready for it. We don't want to do that. So I really encourage you to start with these steps. And as Jens mentioned earlier, remember why you care about this project to begin with, and don't forget to celebrate it. It's okay to have fun, even on a working group. So those are a few take-home messages as this group gets going. And with that, it's almost 7:30, but I want to make sure to provide a little bit of time for you all to just reflect a little bit about today. Are there any light bulb moments that went off? Are there any concerns that you have moving forward? I'll tell you right now, I'm going to have this discussion and then just one more quick question about how you think you should move forward. And then we'll call it a night. Remembering that whatever happens is really up to this group and the working group that you decide to form or not form moving forward. But Jens and I can be available for technical assistance either at the town level for any of you, or to provide some support for a working group as it moves forward. So we'll start with those. Any immediate reactions? light bulb moments, any concerns that came up? What are you thinking?
I think
Yeah.
the idea that you go beyond just corridors and the forest blocks, you think in terms of the animals. I think that's gonna be important for us. I would not have thought that we could lose the animals if these forest blocks and
Yeah.
corridors were decimated.
Yeah.
I think that's gonna be important for us as a selling factor.
Any other thoughts, reactions, ideas?
I really like the it's okay to have fun part.
Absolutely, I think it's so important. Otherwise, nobody's gonna want to engage, right? That's what gets people excited.
And celebrating place.
Exactly, exactly.
Will you bring possums and squirrels to our next meeting?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, just thinking about, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're gonna be starting to discuss this, but now I'm thinking our discussion really has to include the neighboring towns and thinking of a much broader ecosystem than just our immediate community.
I really like the idea of having everybody get involved in the community and identifying where they're seeing wildlife. And in Marlboro, that's already happening with, on Facebook, there's a Marlboro Wild and a Marlboro Birds, and now they're gonna actually join those two Facebook pages. But there's all kinds of people that you wouldn't have even known paid attention to wildlife that are out there taking pictures and identifying every little thing they see. And it's very active, and I don't know if that information can then be uploaded to iNaturalist or something so that it can actually be, used as more scientific data, but this is something maybe to think about.
The Conservation Commission is just finishing up its 7th year of a citizen science wildlife road tracking project, where they've had volunteers out walking road sections, doing tracking, and we've now got all of that data together, and it's sitting on my computer, and I need to crunch the numbers and get them a map back. But so there's some really incredible, exciting citizen science ventures that are out there.
Just adding to what you just said, I live in Marlboro, and in back of the house, I and several of my neighbors share some land, a couple hundred acres, and I've been building ski trails, cross-country ski trails back there. And what I found was one of the joys I had was grooming these trails, because you erase the tracks, any previous tracks, and then when you see new tracks, they're there, they came that night.
Right.
And we've had pretty much most of the species you might expect here in southern Vermont. And of course, last month, my dumpster got raided by bears 4 times. And I have a picture of the bear. So a lot is happening even on these smaller plots. We're just lucky that there aren't many dogs, but there are. And so it would be interesting to join this information. As Nancy said, Marlboro Wild, Marlboro Birds already post some of this information out there, but I don't think that many of us are aware that there's more organized effort. So that's been an eye-opener for me this evening.
Well then, in the interest of time, I think let's take the discussion. I think one of the goals was for this working group to learn more. Correct me if I'm wrong working group, but I think this working group is really wanting to learn more about how to move forward, how to engage any of you who are interested, and what those next steps are. Does that sound right for everybody in the working group? So I'll put that back to you. How do you think this working group should move forward? Do you see any good next steps?
And I'll just add to that question, that's the major intent of the scheduled October meeting, is to get into the details of that. But I think a big intent here in this closing moment is to sort of set that stage for who wants to be involved and what seems like it would be helpful to work on together.
Great, so just to clarify, for the October meeting, is the idea that's really the first meeting of the working group, so if you're interested in being on that working group, there's another meeting.
And
that's
welcoming more public
October
participation too, October 16th.
16th, so would be the first working group meeting. I'll leave it to the local group to figure out how to get that information out to everybody, but what do you all think? Yeah.
I was going to say, if we if I could get a copy of the sign-up list tonight, if nobody minded, just so we began to have some connectivity, so to speak.
There you go. You'll stay
I
connected.
represent my wife and several others here, Hogback Mountain Association, but we'll talk about this, and I'm sure people in our organization already know many folks here. But if that was possible, I think it would be useful. So I'm going to send a note around to everybody anyhow that would include that.
If we set up a committee in our town, wouldn't it behoove us to also ask for a member from a bordering town to be on that committee? Because when you're dealing with, our town butting up against Townsend or whatever, that representative from the other town could help us sell whatever we need to their town and vice versa.
Right. Are you talking about a committee in your town being a conservation commission, or are you thinking of, I'm wondering if this working group is kind of that broader group?
I think the
But
working group
certainly-
would be the broader group, because I'm thinking we could sell Newfane, but maybe we can't sell where Newfane borders, let's say Marlboro or whatnot. So if we had somebody from Marlboro on our team, there's the link.
Maybe that's something to talk about at this working group, perhaps.
I guess I'm confused, because I thought that's what we were talking about doing, is getting these different towns all together for a working group.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
That's-
hear you.
Yeah, so she's saying she's confused. Isn't that what this is about? Is getting these towns together for a working group? Does that?
Yeah,
can I
that's what it-
paraphrase?
yeah.
Could I just say what I took from that really struck me,
Okay.
that I think would be useful to my perspective in Marlboro, is that there's this working group that's working at the level of at least 6 different towns, and it may grow to include other towns in a more branched, arterial network, if you will.
So
but
what are
for-
the 6 towns?
That would be Guilford, Halifax, Marlboro, Newfane, Dover, and Wardsboro. This critical arterial link from Massachusetts up through southeastern Vermont to the Green Mountain National Forest. But for each of us, we got to figure out what we do in our own town. But as you're pointing out, we can't do that well because it depends on our coordination with our immediate neighbors, which is a scale in between the overall working group and individual townships. And I know it would help me in what I'm trying to do in Marlboro, and I feel like I could say for our Conservation Commission as a whole, for what we're trying to do, to have a representative, from someone from Halifax if they were amenable, and someone from Newfane if they were amenable, to partner and advise our process, and likewise for us to provide representation to whatever process would be going on specifically in Newfane, or specifically in Halifax. And that same network where we're kind of creating direct tendrils as well as this overall working group, I think could be really useful. That's something I would never have thought of, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Other thoughts about how to move this forward? All right, it sounds like there's this date, October 16th. It sounds like that might be the first meeting of this working group, as I'm hearing this. This is, again, it will be up to you all to decide. But that sounds to me like what's coming out of this is that can really be that first meeting. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I would suggest, is that the next meeting we tackle 2 topics. One is, what would it look like if we formed a working group? Right, so how would we do that? What would the goals be? Some of these things that you suggested we talk about. But then the other piece is then how can we bring those efforts to the town level, right? So then what could each individual commission do that would help kind of further this goal that the working group has?
It sounds like that's a good goal for the next. Yeah.
I think there were a lot of really good recommendations for materials to read ahead of time, whether it's the Belbin team roles or the community heart and field guide. And to as many people as could read those ahead of time, so that people are coming in all on the same page somewhat. And maybe when you send your email out, you can let people know a couple of those different resources, so that they have the same language when they come to the next meeting.
Mhm. It sounds to me, it's up to you, but it sounds to me like it could be helpful to identify a couple people to help coordinate what's happening at that meeting and then send out the material ahead of time. Does that sound fair?
I also think that something which came up through the presentation tonight, that extending an invitation beyond municipal officials to participate, of course the number needs to be kept to some reasonable level for the group to function, but would perhaps bring a broader range of individuals and their thinking.
That could be a topic for the next meeting, to think about people in each town that.
But meanwhile, the intent for this was for each working group thus far, member in each municipality, to reach out not just to town officials, but also to make this publicly available. And I think
For the second meeting, we were talking
for
about that happening.
For the first one, that was the intent, too.
Oh,
And I don't know how much that actually happened, how much that sort of liaisoning beyond the immediate town governance structure occurred, but I
misunderstood that part.
Yeah, by all means, totally. Evidently, our communication could be improved, or mine could. So it's not up to me, but my take is that that would be a good thing to really hone in on for the next meeting, as you were suggesting, and then build from there to specific key folks as well, but just to get the word out. I think it would be a good problem to have too many people.
I do have one suggestion. If you're forming a working group that's starting really the next time, once that working group gets going, it's certainly good to bring in those individuals who represent different viewpoints. You also might want to be careful about just casting the invitation open and having to start over again. Tonight, everybody at this table at least has had the same background information. You might have some more ideas of how to move forward. Whereas if you invite everybody again, you're certainly going to want to make everybody welcome. You certainly don't want to limit that group. You certainly want to represent those other viewpoints that aren't represented. But you do maybe want to think about moving forward and maybe even thinking about who you are as a working group at some point too, where it is limited to those who already have that knowledge. Does that make sense? Others can join, just like any Conservation Commission or Planning Commission, there can certainly be other voices who join in the mix. But that's my suggestion.
Yeah. And there are representatives of some towns who were involved previously, wanted to be involved, couldn't come this time, so we will have some new people, but they're generally also fairly versed.
I'm certainly not advocating for limiting the group, just merely on.
Yeah. So we will have some more folks, and we'll hopefully have more comprehensive representation of this entire span, and maybe even some of these branches out beyond the artery. So I think maybe a balance is kind of what we're looking at. Could I throw a few specific questions out in preparation for that meeting? Of the folks here who would like to be part of the working group at this point, not a commitment, but an interest to continue on this and explore this in part as a representative of your town. Cool. I wonder if before, those of us who raised our hands, if before we leave we could make a little asterisk next to our name on the sign-in sheet, just so we can keep track of who that is. Would that work for you guys? Cool. Awesome. Another question is, who here is not making a commitment, but interested and think it's possible to maybe attend that next meeting on the 16th of October through Tuesday?
What day is it?
It's Tuesday, same time, same place, probably. Third Tuesday, like today is.